Welcome to The Hidden History of Property, where we uncover the forgotten stories behind what we own, what we share, and how these ideas shaped our world. I'm Liam MacKenzie.
And I'm Amber Whitlock. Liam, I've been thinking about something strange lately. Every time I say my phone or my house, I'm invoking this invisible legal framework that most of us never really think about.
That's exactly what fascinates me about property, Amber. It's simultaneously the most concrete legal concept. This specific object belongs to someone, and the most abstract, existing primarily as a collective agreement rather than physical reality.
Hold on, I need to picture this. Are you saying property isn't real?
Well, the historical record tells us something fascinating here. Property rights, what we can own, how we can use it, how we can transfer it, these aren't fixed concepts. They've evolved dramatically over centuries, shaped by power struggles, philosophical debates, and changing social needs.
So, when did humans first come up with the idea that you could own something? I mean, I can imagine early humans feeling possessive about their tools or weapons, but formal property seems different.
That's the question that launched this entire series. We're taught that property rights emerged naturally as humans settled into agricultural societies. That ownership is somehow intrinsic to human nature. But what if this foundational story is wrong?
Wait, are you suggesting our understanding of ownership has been fundamentally misunderstood?
The evidence certainly points that way. Let me share something I found in the archives last month. A letter from an English villager written in 1607. Listen to this. These fields where our fathers and their fathers before them grazed cattle and gathered wood are now fenced and guarded, turned from the commonwealth to private gain.
That's heartbreaking. I can almost feel their sense of loss.
But what do you think they meant by commonwealth in this context?
I'm guessing not the political entity we think of today, but literally wealth that was common, shared by everyone.
Exactly. And that concept was central to how property was understood for centuries. Imagine you're a villager in 17th century England. The morning dew soaks your boots as you walk to the common pasture. You can hear the bleating of sheep, some yours, some your neighbors, all grazing together on land that belongs to everyone and no one.
That's so different from how we think about property today. I'm trying to imagine explaining to my neighbor that they should let their kids play in my yard whenever they want because it's our common wealth.
And that transformation from common to private is one of the most profound shifts in human history. The enclosure movement in England literally reshaped the landscape, turning open fields into fenced private plots. But it also reshaped society itself.
I'm wrestling with this idea because, on one hand, private property seems so fundamental to how we organize our lives today. But you're suggesting it wasn't always this way?
The historical evidence is clear on this. Property systems have varied enormously across cultures and time periods. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas often had entirely different conceptions of land relationship. Many saw themselves as belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to them.
That completely flips our modern perspective. But I wonder, how did regular people feel about these changes when they were happening? Did they resist?
Absolutely. There were riots, protests, and rebellions against enclosure. One protester in 1607, who called himself Captain Pouch, led thousands in tearing down enclosure fences. When asked by authorities what gave him the right, he patted a mysterious pouch at his side that supposedly contained documents proving the illegality of enclosure.
And did it? What was in the pouch?
When he was finally captured and the pouch opened, it contained only a piece of green cheese.
Wait, like actual cheese? That's both hilarious and tragic.
It is. But it shows how deeply people felt about these changes, enough to risk everything based on a symbolic protest. And that's what this series is about, uncovering how our modern understanding of property emerged not as a natural evolution, but through specific historical choices, conflicts, and power struggles.
That reminds me of something happening today with digital property. When I buy an ebook, do I actually own it? Or am I just licensing it? The terms of service say one thing, but it feels different than owning a physical book.
That's a brilliant connection, Amber. We're living through another transformation in property concepts right now. William Blackstone, the famous 18th century legal theorist, defined property as that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe.
That's intense. Sole and despotic dominion sounds like something from a fantasy novel about an evil overlord.
And it does have that ring to it. But that definition reflected a particular historical moment rather than a universal truth. And I think we're at another pivotal moment now, where digital technology is forcing us to reconsider what ownership means.
So this isn't just about history, it's about understanding where we might be headed.
Exactly. By uncovering the hidden history of property, we gain the power to imagine alternatives and shape what comes next. Property isn't just about things, it's about relationships between people with respect to things.
I love that framing. It makes property feel less like a static concept and more like an ongoing conversation society is having with itself.
That's precisely it. And over the next several episodes, we'll be excavating the layers of this conversation, from ancient communal systems through feudalism, mercantilism, capitalism, to our digital age.
I can't wait to dig in. But before we go further, I have to ask, if property is this flexible concept that's changed so much over time, what does that mean for my house? Should I be worried someone's going to come along with a new definition that says I don't own it anymore?
That's the tension at the heart of property systems. They require both flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances and stability so people can plan their lives. Finding that balance has always been the challenge.
So there's no simple answer?
The historical record suggests not, but understanding how we got here gives us better tools to navigate where we're going. And that's what I hope listeners take from this series. Not just historical knowledge, but a new way of seeing the invisible frameworks that shape our daily lives.
Join us next time as we explore how the concept of property evolved from something you belonged to into something that belongs to you.
To understand property as we know it today, we need to travel back, way back, to when humans first began to settle in one place.
So we're talking about the agricultural revolution? When people stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers and started farming?
Exactly. Around 10,000 BCE, humans began cultivating crops and domesticating animals in what we call the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. This shift fundamentally changed our relationship with the land.
I've always wondered, was there a concept of owning land before agriculture? Like, did hunter-gatherer groups have territories they considered theirs?
That's a fascinating question. Many hunter-gatherer societies did recognize territorial boundaries, but their concept of belonging was quite different from our modern notion of ownership.
Different how?
For most hunter-gatherer groups, the relationship was inverted from our modern perspective. They didn't see themselves as owning the land. They saw themselves as belonging to the land. The territory wasn't property to be bought and sold. It was part of their identity.
That's a profound distinction. So when did the shift happen? When did land become something you could own rather than something you belonged to?
The historical record tells us something fascinating here. This transition wasn't sudden. It unfolded over thousands of years. With agriculture came the need to stay in one place, to invest labor in specific plots of land. Gradually, customs developed around who had rights to use which fields.
But that's still not quite private property as we understand it today, right?
Not at all. Early agricultural communities often managed land communally. In many ancient societies, from Mesopotamia to China to the Americas, land was held by family groups, villages, or tribes, not individual.
So when did individual ownership emerge?
We see evidence of individual land rights developing in ancient Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. Clay tablets from Sumer record land transactions between individuals. But even then, these weren't absolute rights. Land ownership was embedded in complex social obligations.
Wait, so people could buy and sell land, but there were strings attached?
Precisely. In most ancient societies, land rights came with responsibilities to the community. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted with your land, and in many places, ultimate ownership was considered to rest with the gods, the king, or the community. Individuals merely had use rights.
That reminds me of something I read about Native American perspectives on land. Didn't Chief Seattle say something like, "The earth doesn't belong to us, we belong to the earth"?
Yes, though we should be careful about oversimplifying indigenous perspectives. Different Native American nations had diverse approaches to land and territory. Some recognized exclusive tribal territories, others had overlapping use rights. But generally, the concept of selling land as a commodity was foreign to many indigenous cultures.
I can imagine the cultural clash when European colonizers arrived with their ideas about individual property rights.
It was profound. Europeans often couldn't comprehend land systems that didn't match their own concepts. They saw land without fences as empty or unused, even when it was integral to indigenous economies and cultures.
So European colonization wasn't just about taking land, it was about imposing an entirely different understanding of what land is.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the most influential thinkers on property in Western tradition, John Locke.
The philosopher who talked about life, liberty, and property.
The very same. In the late 17th century, Locke developed a theory that profoundly shaped Western concepts of property. He argued that when someone mixes their labor with natural resources, like farming unoccupied land, they create a natural right to that property.
That sounds reasonable on the surface. If I work hard to grow crops, I should have rights to the harvest.
It does seem intuitive, but Locke's theory had far-reaching implications, especially in colonial contexts. Europeans used this labor theory of property to justify claiming indigenous lands. They argued that Native Americans hadn't improved the land through European-style agriculture, so they hadn't established property rights.
That's convenient logic if you're looking to take someone else's land. You're not using it the way we think you should, so it's not really yours.
Precisely. And this highlights something crucial about property. It's not a natural, universal concept. It's a social agreement that varies across cultures and time periods. What counts as legitimate ownership depends on who has the power to define and enforce property rules.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it? It suggests our whole property system rests on power rather than some objective standard of justice.
It challenges us to think critically about property, certainly. But understanding this history doesn't necessarily invalidate our current system. It just helps us see it as one possibility among many, shaped by specific historical circumstances.
So let's fast forward a bit. How did we get from these varied historical understandings to our modern concept of property?
A key turning point was the enclosure movement in England, beginning in the 16th century and accelerating through the 18th century.
Enclosure. That's when common lands were converted to private property, right?
Exactly. For centuries, English villages had operated with a mix of private and common lands. Villagers had rights to graze animals on common pastures, collect firewood from common forests, and farm strips in common fields, all alongside some privately held land.
So people had both private plots and shared access to community resources?
Yes, it was a hybrid system. But during the enclosure movement, these commons were increasingly divided up and privatized, often through acts of parliament that favored wealthy landowners.
I'm guessing ordinary villagers weren't thrilled about losing access to land they'd traditionally used.
That's putting it mildly. There was significant resistance. One contemporary observer wrote, "The poor are robbed of their birthright and nature's gift is monopolized by the few." Enclosure transformed not just land ownership, but the entire social fabric of rural communities.
It sounds like a massive transfer of wealth from the community to individuals.
In many ways, it was. Historians debate the full impact, but enclosure certainly accelerated inequality. Many small farmers couldn't survive without access to commons and became wage laborers. This created a workforce for the emerging factories of the Industrial Revolution.
So there's a direct line between privatizing land and the rise of industrial capitalism?
The connections are strong, yes. As land became more exclusively private property, other resources followed. The Industrial Revolution further transformed property concepts as new forms of wealth emerged. Factories, machinery, stocks, intellectual property.
And I'm guessing these changes weren't just economic. They must have changed how people thought about their relationship to the world around them.
Profoundly. The poet John Clare, who lived through enclosure, wrote about how the landscape itself seemed to change. Fence now meets fence in owner's little bounds, and birds and trees and flowers without a name all sighed when lawless law's enclosure came.
That's beautiful and heartbreaking. He's describing not just a change in land use, but a change in how people experienced their environment.
Exactly. And this transformation of property concepts continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. Property law became increasingly standardized and abstract. Land became less about specific places with histories and meanings, and more about interchangeable units on a market.
So we've gone from belonging to the land belonging to us, to land as just another asset class that can be bought and sold like stocks or bonds.
That's a concise way to frame the transformation. Though I should note that these older conceptions haven't disappeared entirely. They persist in various forms, from indigenous land rights movements to environmental philosophies that challenge the idea of nature as property.
That makes me wonder, are we at another turning point now? With digital property, environmental challenges, and growing inequality, are we due for another transformation in how we think about ownership?
The historical record suggests that property concepts do evolve in response to technological, economic, and social changes. So, yes, I think we're likely in the midst of another evolution, though its exact direction remains to be seen.
This is fascinating, Liam. We've covered thousands of years of history in just a few minutes, but it gives us a foundation for understanding how property isn't some fixed, natural concept. It's a social agreement that has changed dramatically over time.
And that's exactly why understanding this history matters. It helps us see that our current property system isn't inevitable or unchangeable. It's the product of specific choices, conflicts, and power dynamics throughout history.
Which means we have choices about where we go from here.
Precisely. By understanding how property concepts have evolved in the past, we gain insight into how they might evolve in the future, and perhaps even some agency in shaping that evolution. Let's dive deeper into this hidden history of property. When we examine historical records, we find something fascinating. Property wasn't always understood as something you could exclusively own. In fact, for most of human history, the concept of absolute private ownership would have seemed bizarre.
I've been thinking about this a lot. We're so used to saying, my house, or my land. But those statements rest on a whole framework of legal and social agreements that aren't universal or timeless.
Exactly. Let me share something remarkable I found in the archives last year. It's a petition from 1607 by English villagers protesting enclosure. Listen to this. These fields where our fathers and their fathers before them grazed cattle and gathered wood are now fenced and guarded, turned from the commonwealth to private gain.
That's powerful. Commonwealth versus private gain. They're directly contrasting those concepts.
What strikes me is the emotional intensity. These weren't just economic complaints. People felt a deep connection to land they didn't individually own, but had traditional rights to use.
It's almost like they saw themselves as belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to them.
That's brilliantly put. And this perspective wasn't unique to England. When we look at indigenous concepts of land across continents, we find similar ideas. The Lakota phrase, mitakuye oyas eng, all are related, reflects a worldview where humans are part of a reciprocal relationship with land, not its owners.
So when did this shift happen? When did we start thinking about property as something that could be exclusively owned?
It's a gradual transformation with several key turning points. The Roman legal concept of dominium established the idea of absolute ownership, but even then, it was limited to certain types of property and certain classes of people.
And I'm guessing the enclosure movement we mentioned earlier was another major turning point?
Absolutely. Between roughly 1500 and 1850, England transformed from a system where about half the arable land was managed as commons to one where nearly all land was privately owned.
Wait, Half the land was commons? That's way more than I imagined.
Many people don't realize how extensive common rights were. And enclosure wasn't just about physical fences. It required legal changes through thousands of parliamentary acts that essentially transferred wealth from communities to individuals.
I'm trying to picture what this meant for ordinary people. If you're a villager in, say, 1600, and suddenly you can't graze your animals on common pasture or gather firewood from the forest.
It was devastating for many. Historical records show increased poverty, displacement, and social unrest following enclosures. There's a reason the folk hero Robin Hood resonated so deeply. The idea of forest being closed off to common use struck at people's sense of natural justice.
This reminds me of something happening today with digital commons. Think about how knowledge that was once freely shared is now increasingly locked behind paywalls or controlled by algorithms.
That's a fascinating parallel. The historical record shows these tensions around property are recurring. What should be held in common versus what can be exclusively owned.
But there's something I'm struggling with, Liam. If property concepts have changed so dramatically over time, why does our current system feel so natural and inevitable?
That's where John Locke enters our story. In the late 17th century, Locke developed a theory that profoundly shaped Western property concepts. He argued that property rights emerge naturally when someone mixes their labor with resources from nature.
The classic example being, if I cultivate unowned land, it becomes mine because I've mixed my labor with it.
Exactly. But what's often overlooked is the historical context of Locke's writing. He was justifying European colonization of the Americas by claiming indigenous peoples hadn't improved the land through European-style agriculture, so they didn't truly own it.
So Locke's theory wasn't just philosophical, it was political, justifying taking land from people who understood property differently.
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial document I discovered in the British Library archives. A letter from 1724 where a colonial administrator explicitly references Locke to justify displacing indigenous communities.
That's chilling. Theory becoming practice with real consequences for people's lives.
The historical record is full of these moments where property theory intersects with power. Another pivotal figure was William Blackstone, whose famous declaration that property is that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe, became foundational to Anglo-American property law.
That's such an absolute statement. Sole and despotic dominion. It leaves no room for shared rights or responsibilities.
Yet even Blackstone recognized this was more ideal than reality. In the very next paragraph, which is rarely quoted, he acknowledges that property rights are very precarious and slender in their origins.
So even as these absolute theories of property were being formulated, their creators recognized they were somewhat fictional.
Yes, and this tension between theory and reality continues through the Industrial Revolution, when property became increasingly abstract. Land remained important, but new forms of property emerged: stocks, bonds, patents, copyrights.
I'm seeing a pattern here. Each economic transformation, agricultural, industrial, digital, brings new forms of property and new justifications for who should control what.
That's exactly right. And this brings us to perhaps the most significant modern reconceptualization of property: the legal notion of property as a bundle of rights rather than a single absolute thing.
I've heard that phrase before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Think of it this way: when you own something, you don't have a single right but a collection of different rights. The right to use it, to exclude others from it, to sell it, to destroy it, to earn income from it. These rights can be separated and recombined in various ways.
So I might own land, but not have mineral rights beneath it. Or I might own a building, but be restricted by zoning laws about how I can use it.
Exactly. This bundle of rights concept acknowledges that property has always been more complex than absolute ownership. It's a relationship between people with respect to things, not a relationship between a person and a thing.
That's a profound shift in thinking. It means property is fundamentally social. It depends on what rights society recognizes and enforces.
And that brings us to one of the most revealing documents I've found in my research, a 1948 Supreme Court case, United States versus Cosby, where Justice Douglas wrote, "It is ancient doctrine that common law, ownership of land extended to the periphery of the universe, but that doctrine has no place in the modern world."
Wait, so traditionally, if you owned land, you theoretically owned everything above it to infinity?
That was the common law doctrine. Cujus est solum, ejus est usque ad coelum et ad inferos. That is very hard to pronounce. Whoever owns the soil owns up to the heavens and down to the depths. But with the advent of air travel, this became impractical. The court had to redefine property rights to accommodate new technology.
So property rights aren't fixed. They evolve as society and technology change.
Precisely. And this adaptability is crucial for understanding contemporary property debates, from intellectual property in the digital age to the growing recognition of environmental limits on property use.
This is fascinating, Liam, but I'm wondering, if property concepts have changed so dramatically throughout history, what does that tell us about our current system? Is it just one more temporary arrangement that will eventually be replaced?
The historical record suggests property is always evolving. What makes our moment unique is that we're simultaneously dealing with multiple transformations: digital technology challenging intellectual property, environmental crises questioning unlimited use rights, and growing inequality raising questions about distribution.
And I imagine each of these challenges has historical parallels.
Absolutely. Digital copying echoes debates from the early printing press era. Environmental limits recall ancient and indigenous concepts of stewardship rather than ownership. And concerns about inequality have parallels to various land reform movements throughout history.
So understanding this hidden history of property gives us perspective on current debates. They're not unprecedented, but part of an ongoing evolution.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that property arrangements are choices we make collectively, not natural laws we discover. They reflect our values, technologies, and power relationships at particular moments in time.
That's both challenging and empowering. It means we have responsibility for the property systems we create and maintain.
The historical record certainly suggests that, and it's why understanding this hidden history matters, not just for scholars, but for anyone concerned with how we organize resources and relationships in society.
I think I'll never look at a private property sign the same way again.
That's the power of historical perspective. It makes the familiar strange and helps us see that what seems natural and inevitable is actually the product of specific historical choices and circumstances.
And potentially open to change.
The historical record certainly suggests so. Property has never been static. It's always been contested, negotiated, and reimagined as societies evolve. It's time for our Hidden History segment, where we uncover aspects of property rights that rarely make it into standard textbooks or popular understanding.
I've been looking forward to this. What overlooked stories have you uncovered in your research, Liam?
Let's start with something that fundamentally challenges our modern conception of property. In medieval England, land wasn't primarily understood as something you owned. It was something you held in relation to others.
Wait, so people didn't own their land the way we think of ownership today?
Not at all. The historical record shows that land was held within a complex web of mutual obligations. A lord held land from the king and owed military service in return. Peasants held land from the lord and owed labor or a portion of their crops.
So everyone from the king down to the peasant was connected through this network of land relationships?
Exactly. The Latin term was tenere, to hold, which is where we get words like tenant and tenure. Nobody truly owned land absolutely. They held it conditionally within a social system.
That's fascinating. It's almost like land was the social media of medieval times, connecting everyone in a complex network of relationships.
That's an interesting analogy, and like social media, these relationships came with both privileges and obligations. The Lord had rights over the peasants' labor, but also responsibilities to protect them and provide justice.
I'm guessing this system didn't disappear overnight. How did we transition to our modern concept of property?
That's where we find one of history's most overlooked legal revolutions. In the 17th century, English lawyers and judges began reinterpreting these traditional arrangements as contractual relationships rather than social obligations.
So instead of seeing property as embedded in a web of mutual responsibilities, they started seeing it as something that could be bought, sold, and owned absolutely.
Precisely. And I found a remarkable document from 1623, Sir Henry Finch's Law or a Discourse thereof, where he explicitly reframes property as the highest and most absolute right that a man hath to anything. This was revolutionary.
It sounds like they were basically rewriting centuries of legal understanding. Was there resistance to this change?
Tremendous resistance. I've uncovered numerous court cases where ordinary people invoked traditional rights that were being erased by this new conception of absolute ownership.
Can you share an example?
One of my favorites comes from 1649, when a group of commoners called the Diggers occupied St. George's Hill in Surrey. Their leader, Gerard Winstanley, published pamphlets arguing that the earth was made a common treasury for all, and that private property and land violated this natural law.
The Diggers? I've never heard of them. Were they successful?
Not immediately, they were forcibly removed within a year, but their arguments resurfaced repeatedly in later movements for land reform and common rights.
It strikes me that we're taught about political revolutions in school, but these profound shifts in how property was understood seem just as important.
That's exactly why this is hidden history. The transformation of property from a system of mutual obligations to a system of absolute rights underpins our entire economic order, yet it's rarely examined critically.
Let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about land, but what about other forms of property? Were there similar hidden transformations there?
Absolutely. One of the most fascinating concerns intellectual property. For most of human history, ideas, stories, and knowledge were treated as common resources that couldn't be owned.
So when did that change?
The pivotal moment came with the Statute of Anne in 1710, the world's first copyright law. But what's overlooked is that this law was initially intended to limit monopoly rights, not establish them permanently.
Wait, copyright law was meant to limit rights rather than protect them?
The historical record is clear on this. The Statute of Anne granted authors exclusive rights for just 14 years, after which works would enter the public domain. The goal was to balance incentives for creation with the public's interest in accessing knowledge.
That's completely different from how we think about copyright today, where terms extend for the author's lifetime plus 70 years.
Exactly. I found a fascinating letter from Thomas Jefferson in 1813, where he writes that ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe, like fire, expansible over all space, without lessening their density at any point, and like the air we breathe, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation.
Jefferson didn't think ideas could be owned?
He recognized that intellectual property was fundamentally different from physical property. He saw it as a necessary artificial monopoly, not a natural right, and one that should be strictly limited in duration and scope.
This really challenges our modern assumptions about intellectual property as something that should be protected indefinitely.
The historical evidence consistently shows that property regimes, whether for land, ideas, or other resources, have always been contested and have changed dramatically over time.
I'm starting to see why this history remains hidden. These perspectives challenge powerful interests who benefit from presenting current property arrangements as natural, inevitable, or historically consistent.
There's another fascinating hidden history around indigenous concepts of property that were systematically erased during colonization.
I've heard that many indigenous cultures didn't have concepts of land ownership at all. Is that accurate?
It's more complex than that. Indigenous societies had sophisticated systems of resource rights and responsibilities, but these often didn't map onto European concepts of exclusive ownership.
Can you give an example?
The Maori of New Zealand had a system where different groups might have overlapping rights to the same land. One group might have fishing rights, another hunting rights, another gathering rights. These rights were embedded in social relationships and spiritual connections to the land.
So multiple groups could have different types of rights to the same piece of land simultaneously? That's so different from our winner-takes-all approach to property.
Exactly. and colonial powers deliberately misinterpreted these systems to justify land appropriation. I found British colonial documents that explicitly acknowledged indigenous property systems, but dismissed them as primitive to justify imposing European models.
That's a powerful example of how property concepts aren't just abstract legal ideas. They've been weapons in struggles over resources and power.
The historical record tells us something fascinating here. Property rights, what we can own, how we can use it, how we can transfer it, these aren't fixed concepts. They're social agreements that have changed dramatically over time and across cultures.
And understanding this hidden history helps us see that our current property system isn't the inevitable result of natural law or economic efficiency. It's the product of specific historical choices and power relationships.
Precisely. And that understanding opens up possibilities for reimagining property arrangements to address contemporary challenges like environmental sustainability, digital commons, or economic inequality.
This reminds me of something happening today with digital property. We're seeing new models emerge, open source software, Creative Commons licensing, that challenge absolute ownership in favor of shared access and collaborative creation.
Those are perfect examples of property concepts continuing to evolve. And they often draw inspiration from these hidden histories we've been discussing, from commons management systems that existed before enclosure or from indigenous approaches to shared resources.
So history doesn't just tell us how we got here, it can also suggest alternative paths forward.
The historical record certainly suggests so. Property has never been static. It's always been contested, negotiated, and reimagined as societies evolve. We've been exploring the hidden history of property, how concepts of ownership have evolved from communal management to absolute dominion, and back toward more complex understandings. But history isn't just about the past. It echoes into our present and shapes our future.
I've been thinking about that throughout our conversation. These historical shifts in property concepts aren't just academic curiosities, they're playing out in real time today.
Absolutely. Let's explore some of those echoes. One of the most striking parallels is how digital technology is forcing us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about property, much like the printing press did in the 16th century or industrialization in the 19th.
I see that with music and movies. When I was growing up, you owned physical albums or DVDs. Now we just have streaming subscriptions where we access content without ever really owning it.
That's a perfect example. Digital technology has separated the concept of use from ownership in ways that challenge our property frameworks. I found this fascinating court case from 2016 where someone tried to resell their used digital books.
Wait, you can't do that?
That's exactly what the court ruled. Unlike physical books, which you can resell under the first sale doctrine, digital books are typically licensed, not owned. The court determined you don't actually own the digital file.
So we're moving back towards something more like medieval property relationships, where you have usage rights rather than absolute ownership.
That's an insightful connection. The historical record shows property has never been a simple matter of absolute ownership. It's always been a bundle of rights, responsibilities, and relationships. Digital property is making that complexity visible again.
I'm seeing another echo in the climate crisis. When we discussed the commons and enclosure, I kept thinking about the atmosphere and oceans, resources we all share, but that are being degraded because no one has responsibility for protecting them.
The tragedy of the commons playing out on a global scale. Though, as we discussed earlier, Eleanor Ostrom's research shows that tragedy isn't inevitable. Traditional communities developed sophisticated systems for managing shared resources sustainably.
Are there modern examples of that working?
Absolutely. There is a community forest in Vermont where local residents collectively manage thousands of acres for sustainable timber harvesting, recreation, and conservation. It's neither private property nor government land in the conventional sense. It's a modern commons.
That's encouraging. You know what else I'm seeing echoes of? Those enclosure protests we discussed. The language of reclaiming the commons shows up in so many contemporary movements, from open source software to community gardens in urban neighborhoods.
The historical thread is unmistakable. I found manifestos from digital rights activists that echo the diggers' pamphlets from the 1640s almost word for word, just updated for the digital age.
The earth was made a common treasury for all becomes knowledge was made a common treasury for all.
Precisely. And just as the enclosure movement met resistance, we're seeing pushback against the expansion of intellectual property today. The open access movement in academic publishing, Creative Commons licensing, open source software. These are all contemporary versions of commoners asserting alternative models of property.
I'm curious about indigenous property concepts making a comeback too. I recently read about courts in New Zealand granting legal personhood to a river based on Maori concepts of property and relationship to the land.
That's a profound example of how supposedly outdated property concepts are finding new relevance. The Te Awa Tupua Act recognizes the Wanganui River as a legal person with its own rights and interests. It's a direct application of Maori understanding that humans don't own the river, they're in relationship with it.
That feels revolutionary for Western legal systems.
And yet, it has deep historical roots. The historical record shows that many pre-colonial societies understood property not as domination over resources, but as relationships of reciprocity and responsibility.
I'm seeing another echo in how property intersects with inequality today. When we discussed how the enclosure movement concentrated land in fewer hands, I couldn't help thinking about wealth concentration in our time.
The parallels are striking. I found statistics showing that land ownership in Britain is still more concentrated today than during the feudal period, with less than 1% of the population owning over 50% of the land.
That's astonishing. And it's not just land anymore, it's all forms of property, including financial assets.
Exactly. The historical pattern of property concentration followed by social resistance and reform seems to be repeating. We're seeing renewed interest in policies like wealth taxes, community land trusts, and universal basic income, all attempts to rebalance property relationships.
It's like we're having the same arguments that have happened throughout history, just in new contexts.
The historical record certainly suggests so. Property has never been static. It's always been contested, negotiated, and reimagined as societies evolve.
I'm curious about your perspective on digital platforms like Facebook or Google. They've created new forms of property from our data and attention. How does that fit into this historical pattern?
That's a fascinating question. These platforms have essentially enclosed a new commons, our social interactions and personal information, and converted them into private property that generates enormous wealth.
So it's like a digital enclosure movement?
In many ways, yes. And just as with historical enclosures, this has generated both tremendous productivity and serious social tensions. I found this quote from an internet governance researcher who explicitly makes this comparison. Data enclosure, like land enclosure before it, transfers a public good into private hands, often without adequate compensation or consent.
And now we're seeing the resistance phase, with privacy legislation, calls to break up tech monopolies, and platform cooperativism.
Exactly. The historical pattern continues. Property arrangements expand, tensions emerge, and society renegotiates the boundaries.
This makes me wonder about the future. If property concepts have changed so dramatically throughout history, what might they look like a century from now?
While historians are rightfully cautious about prediction, the historical record does suggest certain patterns. New technologies create new forms of property, which initially operate under old rules until social tensions force new frameworks to emerge.
So, what might be the next frontier?
Artificial intelligence raises fascinating property questions. Who owns the output of an AI system trained on billions of human-created works? The company that built the AI? The creators of the training data? Or should it be treated as a new kind of commons?
I hadn't even thought about that. And what about genetic information? Who owns the rights to naturally occurring DNA sequences or modified genes?
These questions don't have simple answers, but history suggests they'll be resolved through the same messy process of social negotiation that has shaped property concepts throughout human civilization.
It's both comforting and concerning to see these patterns repeat. Comforting because it suggests we can find solutions, but concerning because the transition periods often involve significant conflict and inequality.
That's a perceptive observation. The historical record shows that property transformations are rarely smooth or equitable. The enclosure movement created tremendous agricultural productivity, but also widespread displacement and poverty.
So the challenge is finding ways to navigate these transitions more justly.
Precisely. And understanding this hidden history of property gives us tools to do that. When we recognize that property arrangements are social agreements rather than natural laws, we can be more intentional about how we reshape them.
That's why this history matters so much. It's not just about understanding the past, it's about expanding our imagination for what's possible in the future.
The historical record certainly supports that view. Throughout history, people have created diverse property systems to address the challenges of their time. There's no reason we can't do the same.
This conversation has completely changed how I think about property. I'll never look at a private property sign the same way again.
That's the power of uncovering hidden history. It denaturalizes the present, showing that what seems inevitable or natural is actually the product of specific historical choices.
And that means we can make different choices going forward.
Exactly. Understanding the hidden history of property doesn't just satisfy our curiosity about the past, it expands our capacity to imagine and create a more just future. We've covered quite a journey today, haven't we? From the commons of medieval England to the digital frontiers of the 21st century.
It's been eye-opening. I think what strikes me most is how something as fundamental as property, something we take for granted every day, turns out to have this rich, contested history.
The historical record shows us that property isn't a fixed concept, but rather a relationship that societies continuously renegotiate. What's particularly fascinating is how these negotiations reveal deeper values and power dynamics within each era.
I keep thinking about those commoners protesting the enclosures. Their understanding of property was so different from what we have today. They saw the land as something they belonged to, rather than something that belonged to them.
That's a profound observation. I found this quote from a historian named E.P. Thompson who wrote about the moral economy of the English crowd. He said that commoners believed they had legitimate rights, which were supported by an even wider consensus of opinion in the community. Their resistance wasn't lawlessness, it was defending what they saw as established custom.
Which makes me wonder about our own blind spots today. What property arrangements do we take for granted that future generations might find bizarre or unjust?
The historical record suggests that's almost inevitable. Every era has its own property paradigm that seems natural and eternal to those living within it, until it changes.
So, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? Why does this hidden history matter?
I think it matters for several reasons. First, understanding that property concepts have changed dramatically throughout history helps us navigate current transitions with more wisdom. When we face challenges like climate change or digital rights, we can draw on this rich historical experience.
It also gives us permission to imagine alternatives. If property has been reinvented before, it can be reinvented again.
Exactly, and perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that property arrangements aren't natural laws but social agreements. They reflect our values and priorities as a society.
Which means we have both the right and the responsibility to ensure those arrangements serve human flourishing rather than undermine it.
Well put. Throughout this series, we'll continue exploring how property concepts have evolved and shaped our world in ways both visible and hidden.
I'm particularly interested in how different cultures developed different property systems. Not everyone followed the same path, right?
Absolutely not. The historical record reveals remarkable diversity in how human societies organize their relationship to land and resources. That diversity offers valuable lessons as we face contemporary challenges.
I can't wait to explore more of this hidden history with you and our listeners.
Until next time, I'm Liam MacKenzie.
And I'm Amber Whitlock. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the hidden history of property.
We'll see you next time.